Billionaire caught his wife in bed with the janitor. He stood at the door, frozen, his $2,000 Italian shoes barely touching the marble floor he had paid for. His wife, his bed, another man. And not just any man. The janitor. The man who mopped the floors of his empire every single morning. Richard Cole, one of the wealthiest men in America, had built everything. And in one single moment, he watched it all mean nothing. But here's the part nobody saw coming. The truth behind what happened in that room was not betrayal. It was something far more devastating. And by the time this story is over, you will never look at love, loyalty, or money the same way again. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now because we tell stories here that will shake you to your soul. And trust me, you do not want to miss what's coming next. Let's rewind. 18 months before that night, Richard Cole was not always a billionaire. He grew up in a one-bedroom apartment in Cincinnati, Ohio. His mother worked 2 jobs. His father left when Richard was 7 years old and never came back. Richard remembered the exact night his father walked out. It was raining. His mother was standing at the kitchen window, arms folded, crying silently so the kids wouldn't hear. But Richard heard. He heard everything. And he made himself a promise that night. He whispered it into his pillow like a prayer. I will never be poor. I will never be helpless. And I will never leave the people I love. 3 promises. He kept 2 of them. By the time Richard was 34, he had built Cole Industries from a $400 savings account into a technology empire worth $4.2 billion. He had the mansion, the cars, the private jet. He had everything. Except time. Time was the one thing money couldn't print. He worked 20-hour days. He missed birthdays. He missed anniversaries. He answered calls during dinner and sent emails at 2 in the morning. And somewhere in the middle of all that success, he stopped seeing the woman sitting right across from him at the breakfast table. Her name was Claire. Claire Cole. And she was everything Richard was not. She was warm where he was cold, patient where he was restless, present where he was always somewhere else in his mind. They had met in college. She was studying art. He was studying business. She used to laugh and say they were opposites who somehow became each other's missing pieces. That was a long time ago. Claire had tried. Lord knows she had tried. She left notes on his desk. She planned surprise dinners that got canceled. She sat on the edge of the bed at night, waiting for him to put the phone down and just look at her. He never did. Not really. She had a miscarriage 3 years into the marriage that Richard found out about in a text message, because he was on a business call when it happened. A text message. She lost their baby. And he found out in a text. He said sorry. He sent flowers. He went back to work the next morning. Claire sat alone in that massive bedroom, in that massive house, and felt smaller than she had ever felt in her entire life. But she stayed, because she still believed in the man she had married. The boy from Cincinnati who cried into his pillow and made himself 3 promises. She believed he would come back to her. Now let's talk about the janitor. His name was Danny. Danny Holt. 51 years old, quiet, gentle, the kind of man who held doors open for strangers and remembered everybody's name. He had been cleaning the Cole mansion for 11 months when this story begins. Danny was not what you'd expect. Before he picked up a mop, Danny Holt had been a high school music teacher for 22 years in Savannah, Georgia. He had a daughter named Lily. She was 19 years old. She had been diagnosed with leukemia at 16. Danny had spent everything he had on her treatment, his savings, his retirement fund, his house. Everything. When the school had to make budget cuts, Danny's position was eliminated. He applied for over 60 jobs in 4 months. Nobody called back. Until Coal Industries, a state management agency, offered him a cleaning position at the Coal Mansion. He took it without hesitation. Every single dollar he earned went to Lily's medical bills. Every single dollar. Claire met Danny on a Tuesday. She had been having a panic attack in the garden. She didn't know he was nearby trimming the hedges. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat on the ground a few feet away, quietly, like he was just resting. And somehow, that quiet presence was enough to slow her breathing down. When she finally looked up, embarrassed, he just smiled and said, "My daughter has those too. What helps her is breathing in for 4 counts, holding for 7, and out for 8. You want to try it together?" She did. It worked. That was how it started. Not with attraction, not with desire. With breathing. With one broken person recognizing another. Over the following months, Claire and Danny would talk in the garden sometimes. Just talk. About life, about loss, about the strange loneliness of being surrounded by everything and still feeling empty. Danny would tell her about Lily, about the way she used to sing in the kitchen when she was little, about how much he missed being her father before the illness changed everything. Claire would listen, really listen, the way nobody had listened to her in years. And Danny would listen to her too, about the miscarriage, about the empty dinners, about falling asleep alone in a house with 22 rooms. He never once tried to take advantage of her pain. He just witnessed it. And for Claire, after years of being invisible in her own home, being seen was more powerful than anything in the world. Now I need you to stay with me here, because this is where the story takes a turn that almost nobody sees coming. And if you think you know where this is going, I promise you, you don't. Make sure you're subscribed, because the second half of this story will completely destroy everything you think you know about what you just heard. The night Richard came home early. It was a Wednesday. His most important business trip of the year had been cut short because a deal had fallen through in London. He was furious. He was exhausted. He didn't call ahead. He walked through the front door of his own home at 10:47 in the evening. The house was quiet. He walked up the stairs. The bedroom door was slightly open. He pushed it. And there they were. His wife, Danny, in his bed. But here's what Richard saw that he could not explain. They were fully clothed. Claire was sitting upright against the headboard, her eyes red from crying. Danny was sitting on the edge of the bed, his hands folded in his lap. Between them on the mattress was a small notebook. Richard didn't see any of that at first. He saw red. He exploded. He screamed. He threw his phone against the wall. He called Danny every name you can imagine and grabbed him by the collar and dragged him out of the room. Danny didn't fight back. He didn't say a single word. He just looked at Richard with the most heartbreaking expression Richard had ever seen on a human face. And then he was gone. Richard turned to Claire. She wasn't crying anymore. She was strangely calm. And that calm terrified Richard more than anything. She looked at him and said 6 words he would never forget for the rest of his life. "Read what's in the notebook, Richard." He didn't want to. Part of him didn't want to know. But he picked it up. And he read. The notebook was Claire's. She had been writing in it for 2 years. It was not a diary of an affair. It was a letter. A long, devastating, heartbreaking letter to Richard that she had never been able to say out loud. It was every dinner he missed, every night she cried alone, the miscarriage, the loneliness, the slow death of feeling loved. And the last entry, written that same night. It said, I asked Danny to sit with me tonight because I needed someone to be here when I told you I'm leaving. I didn't want to be alone when I made this decision. He's been kind to me the way you used to be. He's not my lover, Richard. He's the only person in this house who ever treated me like I mattered. I'm sorry. I still love you, but love isn't enough when the person you love has stopped showing up. Richard read it 3 times. Then he sat down on the floor. Not the bed, the floor. Because the floor felt like the right place for a man who had just realized he had destroyed the greatest thing he had ever been given. He called Danny the next morning. Danny answered on the second ring. Richard said, "I owe you an apology, and I owe you an explanation of what I was really afraid of when I walked into that room." Danny was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mr. Cole, the only thing I did was listen to your wife. I think that's all she ever needed." Richard didn't respond for a long time. Then he said, "How's your daughter?" Danny paused. "She had a good week," he said quietly. "Thank you for asking." Here comes the plot twist. The one that will break you completely open. Richard hired a private investigator. Not to investigate Claire, not to investigate Danny. To investigate himself. He wanted to know, from an outside perspective, exactly what kind of husband he had been. The investigator came back 3 weeks later with a report. Richard sat in his office and read it alone. It detailed missed events, broken promises, documented moments where Claire had reached out and he had failed to respond. But buried in the middle of the report was something the investigator had found while looking into Claire's background. Something Richard had never known. Something Claire had never told him. 6 years ago, before the miscarriage, Claire had been approached by one of Richard's biggest business rivals. A man named Patterson. Patterson had offered Claire $2 million. $2 million. To leave Richard, to publicly humiliate him, to take half his assets in a divorce that would have destabilized coal industries at its most vulnerable moment, right before Richard's biggest IPO. Patterson had told Claire that Richard was already planning to leave her, that he had another woman, that Claire was being used. All of it was a lie. A calculated, cruel lie designed to destroy Richard's empire. Claire had said no. She hadn't told Richard because she didn't want him to feel guilty. She didn't want him to think she had stayed with him as some kind of sacrifice. She had stayed because she loved him. Even when it hurt. Even when he wasn't showing up. She had protected his empire without him ever knowing. And then she had spent 3 more years slowly disappearing inside it. Richard drove to the apartment Claire had moved into after leaving the mansion. He knocked on the door. She opened it. He didn't say anything clever. He didn't have a speech prepared. He just held up the investigator's report and said, "I know what you did." Claire went very still. "You protected me," he said, "when I didn't deserve it, when I wasn't even paying attention. You protected everything I built, and I repaid you by disappearing." His voice broke. And Richard Cole, a man who had not cried since he was 7 years old, pressing his face into a pillow in Cincinnati, stood in a hallway and wept. Claire didn't move for a long moment. Then she opened the door wider. They didn't fix everything that night. Real love doesn't work that way. They sat at her small kitchen table, not the grand dining room of the mansion, just a small table with 2 mismatched chairs, and they talked until the sun came up. About the boy in Cincinnati, about the girl who studied art, about all the moments they had let slip through their fingers, about who they wanted to be now. Richard sold 30% of his stake in coal industries 6 months later. He used part of the proceeds to set up a foundation, a medical fund for families of school employees who had lost their jobs and couldn't afford health care for their children. The first beneficiary of the foundation, Lily Holt, Danny's daughter. Danny went back to teaching. A small school in Maryland offered him a music position, partly because Richard made a very generous donation to their arts program. Danny never asked for it. He never knew it was coming. He just showed up one morning and found out the school had suddenly received enough funding to rehire him full-time. He cried in the parking lot for 20 minutes. Then he walked inside and taught his first class. Richard and Claire renewed their vows on a beach in North Carolina. No guests, no cameras, no press. Just the two of them and an officiant. Claire wore a simple white dress. Richard wore jeans and a white shirt. He had written his vows on a piece of paper torn from a notebook. He read them slowly, and in them he made 3 new promises. Not to a pillow, not to a child in the dark, to her, to the woman who had stayed when she had every reason to leave. Here is what this story is really about. It is not about betrayal. It is not about wealth. It is about the terrifying cost of taking the people you love for granted. It is about the quiet heroism of people who stay and protect and endure without ever asking for recognition. Danny Holt was not a villain, he was a mirror. He showed Richard exactly what love looks like when it's actually present. And Richard had the rare, brutal gift of being able to see himself clearly, before it was too late. Not everyone gets that gift. Some people walk through that door, destroy everything in their path, and never pick up the notebook. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the people in your life you might be taking for granted right now, don't just sit with that feeling. Do something with it. Call someone, text someone. Put the phone down at dinner tonight and just look at the person across from you. Because the most expensive thing in the world isn't a mansion or a private jet. It's a person who loves you quietly for a very long time and then finally gently stops. If you made it to the end of this story, you are exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. Hit that like button if this story touched something in you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe, because every single week, we bring you stories that remind you what it means to be human. We'll see you in the next one.